A very long time ago, in a land not so far away, there lived a pathogen king named Eruginosa. He ruled over the kingdom of Epidermia. Epidermia was a very harsh and inhospitable land, and King Eruginosa's people could not thrive in such a desolate landscape. So the king set out on a quest to find the legendary lush paradise of Matrix Extracellularia. It has long been foretold that anyone who enters its gardens shall experience everlasting prosperity and eternal life. The king and his men relentlessly search for a way past the impenetrable barrier that surrounds Epidermia. They passed through the arid landscape. They nearly gave up hope when suddenly they found it. It wasn't quite what they had envisioned. The cave was quite a bit shy of being ordinary. The king turned to his squire and gave him his order. "Return to the kingdom. Tell everyone their king summons them. Bring them here. I shall go on ahead and make sure it is safe. Wait for my return." The king's squire bowed his head.
"It shall be done, sire."
With a crack of his whip, his battle flea let out a shriek, and in a cloud of dust he was gone. The king ordered one man to stand guard as they slowly entered the opening. The king and his men crawled through single file. Just as the last man stepped through, the opening began to close. Everyone began to panic. The guard outside the opening stuck his banner pole through the hole to help pull everyone to safety. It was no use. The opening closed on the banner, sealing the cave with the king and his men still inside. The air was still. It was so quiet that even silence had an echo. The king and his men were lost. The cave opening vanished without a trace, except for the banner sticking out, a grisly reminder of what remained entombed inside. It is now hundreds of generations later. A kingdom now stands where the banner is, New Epidermia. The city has grown into a metropolis filled with people going about their daily lives. In the central part of the city is a monument of statues dedicated to the lost king and his men. The statues all face a lone banner sticking out of the area that once held the promise of paradise. A class field trip is visiting the site and learning about the legend of the lost king. Among the children is Prince Gino, the royal descendant of the lost king Eruginosa. The teacher enthusiastically tells the story of how on this very site, King Eruginosa and his brave knights heroically searched for a new land, a land in which the promise of eternal life and everlasting prosperity. Even though Prince Gino has heard the story nearly every day of his life, this time it was different. This time he stood on the ground where his forefathers stood, and he began to imagine himself as the lost king and what it must have been like all those generations ago. A squeaky voice rudely interrupts a perfectly good daydream.
Prince Gino!
Prince Gino looks down to see one of the yearbook club kids with a camera.
Can I take your picture with the statue of the lost king for the yearbook?
He nervously asks. Okay, the prince replied, confidently trying to mask his embarrassment. The prince strikes his most generic royal prose that resembles every single painting ever produced in the royal hallway. "How's this?" the prince asks.
That's pretty good, but how about some action poses? Pretend you were actually there,
directed the photographer. The prince, enjoying the moment, began making one silly pose after another. Soon, all the kids began copying the prince, climbing on and around the statues, posing for pictures. For the final picture, everyone climbed on the huge sign that read Cave of the Lost King and made silly faces. But the sign couldn't stand the weight.
"Falling over!"
yelled the photographer. All the kids jumped off the sign immediately and it began to lean back in place. Whew, the prince sighed as he wiped his brow. That was a close one. But the prince spoke too soon because the sign overcorrected and fell over the opposite way into a statue of one of the king's knights, and that statue fell into the next like a giant stack of dominoes. One by one, the statues collapsed around the prince and his classmates. The prince helplessly gasped as the statues fell over and hit the statue of the lost king, holding up his sword. The statue was larger than the rest and seemingly stopped the cascade. The children peeked through their fingers and were slightly relieved that the whole ordeal was over.
At least the king statue is still standing,
said the photographer with a nervous chuckle, when the head of one of the statues fell off and started rolling towards the king's statue. Slowly coming to a stop, it gently taps the king's statue. The king's statue plummets towards the banner sticking out of the former cave opening. Sword in hand, the king's statue thrashes into the banner, slicing open the cave like a well-calculated blow. As the dust settles, the prince stares into the opening. Paradise awaits them. As the prince steps through the opening, he finds a book with a letter from the old king attached to it. The letter reads, "To the people of Epidermia, I've found paradise. The local inhabitants are known as leukocytes. There are different tribes of leukocytes. I have met macrophages and neutrophils. They tell us of others that exist deeper in the cave, but I have yet to see any. The macrophage have a book that holds their laws and procedures. I have been unable to learn their writing, but they tell me the cover says, 'To protect and to serve.' They've been so accommodating to us thus far. I am considering making them subjects under my crown. They have learned to recognize our royal symbol. They call it an antigen. They make antibodies that can connect to our antigen to let them know it's their duty to serve us. Should you encounter a macrophage, make sure you show them your royal emblem, or antigen as they call it. They will gladly serve you as they served myself and my brave knights. I look forward to meeting all of you in paradise. Your loving king, Eruginosa." The prince leads the people who are eager to find paradise through the opening. One by one, his people enter with excitement and wonder. "Who goes there?" shouts a figure in the dark. The prince can vaguely make out a large, robust shadow slithering into the light. "I am Prince Gino, descendant of King Eruginosa and rightful heir to this paradise," the prince replied. "Who, might I ask, are you?" the prince asked in his most authoritative voice. "I am a macrophage. I am the guardian of this sector. You must have an identification to travel through here. Show me your antigen," the macrophage demanded, as he looked through a large book that looked exactly like the one the king left for them. The prince remembered the king's letter and held up his royal seal. The macrophage studied the antigen and said, "I must consult the historians. They have a better memory than I do. In the meantime, I will draw a chemokine bath for you to enjoy. It is to die for. While we wait, I will call on reinforcements to help serve you." The macrophage closed his book and started to secrete a soothing chemical bath. Prince Gino and his people stared at each other, unsure of how to act. So the prince sat in the chemokine bath and motioned his people to do the same. Not too long after, neutrophils began to show up, as well as more macrophages. The macrophage said to Prince Gino, "We are preparing a feast so we can serve you. We shall lead you to the banquet hall." The prince relayed the message to his people and ordered them to go along with the macrophages. Prince was introduced to the memory B cell. "These are our historians. They will know if your kind was served here before." The memory B cells were much smaller than the macrophages. They were more focused on the prince's antigen than the prince himself.
"We recognize your antigen. We have served your kind before. We shall serve you again,"
explained the memory B cells. Macrophage and neutrophils began leading the pathogens towards the banquet hall. Something caught the prince's eye as he walked by a vent. The prince notices a shiny sparkle in the small vent next to the banquet hall. He sneaks away from the macrophage and finds the old king's helmet at the opening of the vent. "What is this doing here?" the prince thought to himself. "This looks like the old helmet of King Eruginosa that's in the painting, hanging in the royal library." Prince Gino noticed the vent was loose and pulled the vent cover off and crawled into the vent. As he crawls through the vent, he comes upon the king's rotting skeleton. The phrase, "to protect and to serve," is a lie. "Look," is inscribed on the wall, written in the king's blood with an arrow pointing into the vent. The prince hears noises outside the vent. As the prince peers through the vent, he gasps, his face now covered in a look of horror. Prince Gino flashes back on the many things the macrophage said to him. This chemokine bath is to die for. We've served your kind before. We will serve you again. The prince runs out of the vent, now terrified of the macrophages. He tells his people to leave immediately, but his people are surrounded by the macrophage and neutrophils. He runs to the opening to warn everyone. The opening begins to close as a macrophage grabs the prince's flagella. The prince takes out the book and holds it up over his head and shouts as loud as he can, "You must run from here! To protect and to serve, it's not what we think! To protect and to serve, it's a cookbook!" The opening closes around the prince's hand holding up the book. What both the king and Prince Gino didn't realize, to protect and to serve wasn't a lie. They made the grave mistake of not asking the right questions. Who was being protected and who was being served?